that. It's really stupid, but whatever. Okay. All right. We're live, and for some reason, there it is. It's not as dark. Okay. So let's see. Let's get our sign-in sheet. All right, some things to talk about today, as well as our lecture. So let's see, I think we want to just wrap it, all the new news into the lecture. So, all right, so today, our last week together, I wanted to take this time to take all the information that we gathered, right? All the information that we've learned together and synthesize it into one lecture in summary, okay? All right, so we're going to take a look from the beginning. Very beginning, we took a look at, first off, the definition of culture, right? So it is system of ideas, knowledge, values, beliefs, plans, learned in society, guided by behavior, and varying by history, geography, and natural environment, right? Talked briefly about culture shock. Some of us have experienced it, some of us haven't, right? Said a fair amount of culture shock has to do with this feeling of being in an awkward position, right? Where it's as if you're out of your element. Anthropologists were told that when we go into the field, into another culture, we're to act like children, as if we're young kids being taught for the first time how to behave, right? Okay, so talking about that, and also about our experience of a reverse culture shock in coming home, right? I experienced some reverse culture shock just this fall, right? I think we've talked a little bit about it. One of the things that happened is I immediately gained weight, right? As soon as I got home, right? It was like I was excited to be home. Another thing that happened about culture shock and coming back was this feeling of, oh no, all of a sudden I feel like I don't belong anymore. Yeah, and I've done this a lot. I've come back a lot from the field, and yet still, on this occasion, still the same awkward, weird feeling, right? Okay, went into talking about the different fields of anthropology, focusing primarily on cultural anthropology, but we briefly talked about archaeology, paleo, and the like, emphasizing a little bit more on ethnographies, right, where we have descriptions of other cultures. And then we went into, on this first week, looking at the reading of the Nasarema. What was the Nasarema? Who were the Nasarema? I know you all know. The Americans, thank you. All right, so the Americans spelled backwards. And the reading was about taking an approach toward looking at our own culture, but from the perspective as if we were foreigners, right? And we had this write-up that was really weird about our own culture and almost was difficult to figure out that it was our own culture, right? Okay, so taking a look at the ethnographic writing about that. Looked at culture clash and what that means, especially as it relates to whaling, right? And environmentalism, right? So that clash between the culture of animal rights activists and the like, and those that want to return to whaling, even though it's been some 70 years later, right? Compared that case also with the Umialit up in Barrow, Alaska, right? So make sure that you can distinguish between the gray whale and the macaw, right? And the Umialit, who are whaling after the bowhead. Okay, so make sure that we're going to distinguish those groups. Okay. All right. Also got into the discussion of ethnocentrism and relativism. And in the very beginning, if you remember the way we spoke about it, it was almost as if there was kind of a continuum where we had ethnocentrism on one side and cultural relativism on the other, right? And so that's how we started learning off about ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. And then in the last section of our classes, we learned a little bit about cultural relativism and human rights. Maybe something a little bit surprising, right? We say human rights is universal, and yet when you look at human rights, not all of those things that cultures around the world consider a right are being upheld. In fact, maybe some things that some might feel not happy about in terms of behaviors, we might have something to say about critiquing them, right? We talked about female circumcision as our example. Also talked about intellectual property rights. You remember what that was about? We talked about quinine in the very beginning when we referred to intellectual property rights. We said, you know, way back a long time ago, when we first started having contact with South America, we had a group of indigenous people, right, that knew a fair amount about this thing that they called the holy bark tree, right? Talking about the Quechua in Peru. And in that connection with colonists that were coming and going, we find that the colonists learn about quinine, they learn about the benefits of it in terms of being able to ward off malaria, and they take it in and use it with gusto, right? We even have tonic water today, which still, Schweppes tonic water, right? We talked about that, which contains quinine for travelers, right? That was the traveler's tonic water that we used. And yet, very little recognition of the indigenous knowledge of this, the indigenous transfer of knowledge, right? The value of intellectual property rights around the world. Okay, so we kind of led into our discussion about knowledge of the environment from this discussion of intellectual property rights, but we'll get there. Okay, all right, so that was week one. We talked about Cultural Survival and Survival International as being beneficial NGOs in helping protect indigenous people. Then we went on to talk about theory, right? And in theory, we reviewed the concept of evolution as it relates to archaeology, but then we went into it as it relates to cultural anthropology, right? And we said, well, in the very beginning, we had Edward Taylor talking about things. Your textbook talks about Edward Taylor, right? And then we had a separate reading by Lewis Henry Morgan. Difficult reading, dated reading, right? Talking about cultural evolution, suggesting that there are groups that haven't evolved, right? We called this early evolutionism. This is around the same time as Adam Smith talking about the evolution of the economy, about the same time that Darwin's talking about the evolution of species. And here we are talking about it from the perspective of culture. Kind of a scary concept when you think of it. And looking at where we went with it, yeah, it was scary. So we proposed this idea called unilinear evolution. Remember that evolution in terms of sociocultural ways, in this regard, happens only one way. So we had the theorists that said, well, you evolve from this to this to this to this. And those that haven't evolved from one stage to the next are stuck, right? So we have these levels of stages that he proposed. He says, first is the infancy of human culture, where we have savagery, right? And then as we advance, as we get more complex as a society, we can come into being in barbarianism, right? These terms are just really fascinating when you look at them, right? And then lastly, we have civilization. And he placed the Native Hawaiian group, right, in the upper stage of savagery. Do you remember why? No pottery, right? We had this idea that, well, you know, you have to invent this language, complex language, belief systems, monotheism, right? Literature. And in this stage, we had to invent pottery, and we didn't. So, not as evolved, stuck in savagery. They're a bunch of savages, is what we're led to believe here, right? Why didn't they develop it? Because they wanted to be stuck in savagery? Didn't need, right? What did they have instead? Pardon? Gourds, right? Good, excellent. You're looking at your notes. Well done, awesome. Very good job. Gourds, coconuts, right? Baskets. Yeah, she did an awesome job taking notes. Yeah, everybody want to study with her. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you turn red. Very good, though. Okay. So we had other products didn't need that. Therefore, we're looking at this schema and saying, geez, Lewis Henry Morgan, this is pretty racist when you think about it, right? And yet we've used this schema in a lot of circumstances, right? Even today, you can see in the news, we have references to barbaric groups or savages, and we use this terminology in a way to relate the idea of some being more socially advanced than others, right? Okay. But we also recognized that when we looked into ethnocentrism, when we looked into cultural relativism, we find Franz Boas talking to us about, do you remember the theory? We have cultural relativism. That's one of his theories. What's the other theory he has?
Historical particularism.
Excellent. You guys are great. Okay. Historical particularism, right? Meaning different places have different kinds of environments, right? Different histories, and therefore different needs for a culture developing, right? So we might have the development of exactly some of the most evolved places in the world viewed as if they're savage just because they don't conform to our norm. Okay. I'm not going to touch too much right now on Frederick Engels' Marxism and matrilineal descent. Just covered particularism. We did take a look at various other theories, including sociobiology, right? We looked into sociobiology and we said there's this concept that we call altruism, and we're not so sure that it is what it is, right? So altruism brings forth this idea of selflessness, right? And we said, there might be another way to look at this, right? And what's the other way to look at it? Why might people be motivated to act selflessly? Yeah.
They can get something out of it for themselves.
Great, perfect. They can get something out of it for themselves. Looking good or notoriety or what have you, right? Or even higher on the level of looking like a desirable mate, right? Because you're embodying those kinds of qualities, okay? So, not so sure that altruism is what it is, not so sure that we have an actual selflessness. In fact, we have some theories that we looked at that suggest that we're incredibly selfish, right? One of them was the Pleistocene overkill theory. What was that?
We overused our resources.
Overused our resources during the Pleistocene era, right? Killed off all the megafauna because we just plain overhunted. When given the chance, we will overhunt, fish the last fish. And that's what we did, shot ourselves in our foot, right? All right, so that kind of assessment would line up with that theory. Again, all of them just theories, right? Not necessarily fact, right? Talked about what it's like to work with women in the field, and we admitted that actually we have some problems, right? I admitted, I myself as a female have huge problems working with women in the field, especially in different cultures, especially when they don't talk Spanish or English, right? Remember talking about the Mayagna, that virtually all, not all, but virtually all, the vast majority of the Mayagna women don't speak Spanish, which means if I'm going to talk with them, I have to talk through a male that can translate, right? Missing that direct female-to-female voice, or as we learned from the study in India by Spivak, we've got what she called the subaltern voice, right? That we're a subordinate kind of a group, not dominatory, that we're alternate, right? We're not mainstream in terms of society. And sometimes we can't even speak. Or in other words, people can't hear our voice, right? Because of things like this. How many people thought about women around the world being voiceless in this regard? Anybody? We all assumed women had a voice. Maybe a little bit, yeah? Okay, but others tending to assume that women have the ability to stand up and talk. Yeah, maybe not so much. Okay, all right, so we got some healthy skepticism. Right? Okay. Talked about interpretive approaches, said, when we look at anthropology, it's possible for us to say that everything is an interpretation based on our cultural lenses, right? Furthermore, looking on to postmodernism, not only is it just an interpretation, but our education taught us how to look. Our education taught us how to think, taught us how to use anthropology and the tools of anthropology to make commentary about other cultures, right? So to that regard, Michael Foucault, right, one of our famous postmodernists, said, hey, anthropology is just another reflection of anthropology. It's really not a reflection of other cultures. It's just reflecting how we do stuff, right? Bringing up the term hegemony, right? When people are dominated, yet they don't even realize it, right? It's possible that anthropologists have come out and made statements about other cultures in significant ways that are dominatory, and yet the rest of the world might not even realize it because they are so dominated by that hegemonic idea given in academia, be it liberal, be it Marxist, be it conservative, be it capitalist, whatever have you, right? Hegemonic, okay? Then we also talked about native anthropologists. I mentioned my friend, my Mayagna chief that took over to Hawaii Bishop Museum. You remember that? And we saw one of the things that was on display there that was a fork used to eat people. And he said, did Fiji get the opportunity to decide that this was what represented their culture, right? Bringing forth maybe a value to incorporating native anthropologists in their own representation of their own culture, right? Okay. Moved on to methods and ethics and application. Talked a little bit about female circumcision, right? As one of the challenges we have in dealing with human rights. World Health Organization says it's against the human rights of women, right? Have some cultures that say should be able to have it. So we had this discussion about this, right? Took a look at the case of the bones on North Shore of Kauai, right? At Naui, Camp Naui, YWCA, Camp Naui. Iwi means bones, right? That's when Iwi. Okay, and we suggested that there was very little attention to those bones as protecting the sacred sites of people that were indigenous or any kind of a culture, right? Similar case with the Kumeyaay here. Took a look at a couple of anthropologists that have been conducting questionable fieldwork, right? Talking about questionable subjects with those underage, producing information where we're claiming other culture groups are aggressive, warlike, resemble apes, right? No wonder Napoleon Chagnon was asked to leave Venezuela and never come back. We went over a fair number of ethical concerns in our research, right? Informed consent being number one. Remember, with military participation, we're participating in the military as anthropologists. That informed consent and confidentiality is something that we just cannot provide for them. This is why the American Anthropology Association says no, we should not participate in the military, not work for the military, right? Okay, talked about consequences of participating in studies. Sometimes they can be severe. Talked about the need to ensure that woman's voice, the female voice, and protecting vulnerable populations, maybe even paying people that help us in the studies, right? Payment of informants, although we talked about how difficult that can be and how expensive it can get, right? We reviewed that a lot of research out there is sponsored. Also talked about the fact that a lot of science out there being done today is science that's not being confirmed by further scientific studies, right? Anthropology, food science, economics, psychology, some of those are the biggest problem areas of not being able to reproduce their studies, right? Meaning, got to be careful with what we're learning there, okay? Talked about advocacy and honesty of results. Again, the military. What do you remember about Kennewick Man? Bless you.
The women's here claimed the remains to be an ancestor of theirs.
Right.
It was protected as sacred cultural property.
Yes. So we developed NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, where we're mandated to, if we dig something up like that, we're mandated to repatriate or rebury. Or in this special case, if we want to have some kind of study on something like Kennewick Man, we have to run it by the group before we even consider doing anything, right? And it has to have legal judge approval in that regard. Extra special protections guaranteed to those groups, right? Okay, there's the case of the Kumeyaay. We went into the scientific method, emphasizing operational definitions. Remember, operational definitions are huge, not just in anthropology, okay? If you go back and you look at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, one of the very first things that the ICC had to deal with was genocide from Rwanda. Do you remember genocide in Rwanda? Remember that horrible war that was in Rwanda? Did you ever learn about it? Anybody? Yeah? Okay. Horrible, right? We developed the definition of genocide, and in the very beginning, when we wrote the definition, we wrote it in such a way that we excluded the genocide of Rwanda. We had to rewrite it so that we could get the definition correct and actually be able to prosecute a country or a group for such a horrific crime as genocide. So, operational definitions are critical, not just in science, but also in law when we're going to prosecute, right? From there, let's see, reliability, validity assessment, just spoke about that in relation to the studies. And let's see, let's keep going. On to ecological anthropology. When we studied ecological anthropology, we made special note that ecological is in reference to envisioning the human as a part of the ecosystem, right? So we took a look at what's happening in the ecosystem, right? Climate and whatnot. We took a look at the ecological footprint and the measurements. Examined Malthus's essay on population and the idea that population might someday overshoot its resource base, right? Cool noise. And then we went in further to take a look at land from the indigenous perspective, right? We looked at the Gilbert reading and this idea that, gosh, you know, how it's almost absurd that we ask this question. How do we protect indigenous people? And the question was posed, how can we justify it, right? One justification for protecting indigenous people was cultural biodiversity, right? Just in the protection of them as a distinct culture group, right? Then we went further to say, you know, a lot of these places where indigenous people are, and there's 370 million of them around the world, right? We said they tend to be biodiversity hotspots, right? And we said that when we're preserving indigenous cultures, it's also the case that we're preserving areas of the environment where they're living. Okay? We went a little bit further in the next week, right? So we started this discussion about what happens when indigenous people are separated from their land, what happens when they're extinguished, right? And we looked at both an introduction into the UN DRIP, rights of indigenous people under the UN, and also the ILO, the International Labor Organization. Now, something interesting for us to note, the UN has a very specific definition of what it means to be indigenous. Very detailed. The ILO has what we would call an open reference. They say it's not a definition. They say it's only that the ILO applies to this specific group of people, and then they go on to describe it. That description incorporates a very loose idea of indigeneity or tribal, right? Tribal can mean something that's not specifically indigenous necessarily, okay? So we have a couple of different approaches to defining indigenous. Then we took our midterm, right? Final is not a cumulative. So we stopped for our information for our review there, right? And now from the midterm on is what you'll expect on your final, okay? So the first thing we got into was environmental anthropology. Different from eco-anthropology, ecological anthropology, in that we're taking a look more at how we manage land, how we conceptualize land, and how we manage land. So we looked at language. We said, wow, you know, some people say we have universal grammar, but some say, no, there are things in languages you just can't translate, right? Like those funny jokes in one language that you just can't translate into another, right? By example. And if that's the case, if there are things that you just can't translate into another language, and we have specific names and detailed information in our languages about what we see around us, our environment, right? Then that means every language is special, unique, and encoding specific information about that specific environment in that language and that culture. Terminate the language, separate the culture from the land, and you're separating that continuance of knowledge. Well, why do we care about that knowledge? What is it that the indigenous people have to offer about their knowledge that we even care about? Why do we care about it?
Because they know a lot of like medical things and stuff.
A lot of medical things, yeah. All the environmental ecologies and everything like that. Taking it a little bit further down the road, if we're concerned about our future and how we evolve and adapt to whatever kind of changes we can see, having as many different kinds of alternatives, successful ways of living in different environments can demonstrate to us how to survive. We eliminate all those different kinds of alternatives of lifestyles, and we don't have those kinds of examples to learn from. And we don't have those kinds of critical populations protecting the front line of those environments that are critically endangered, right? Okay, so we learned about knowledge. Jared Diamond said, went and studied the 4A, right? And we learned from the 4A that there's some strange things about knowledge, right? I mean, I thought 100% indigenous people would know about stars. All indigenous people have to know about stars, right? All indigenous people, from my experience, know a lot about fish too. They like to eat fish. And lo and behold, here we have a group that only knows one fish and has no knowledge of stars. Sup with that? What was going on? What did we find out? What did we learn about indigenous knowledge from this group? How come only one fish? Probably didn't live by water, right? So weren't around it. Use it or lose it, right? What about the stars? Canopy of trees, couldn't see them. All right, so we learned that environmental knowledge is utilitarian based, meaning it's got utility, it's got use. And if you use it, you maintain it. If you don't use it, you lose it, right? Use it or lose it is the way that we think of it, right? So bringing this even a step further in talking about land rights, removing indigenous people from their land is akin to eliminating part of their language, eliminating part of their knowledge, all of which is what we depend on for our human survival, right? Okay. From there, we went in to take a look at the Cree and their management of the caribou, learned a fair amount about the development of traditional environmental knowledge and maintaining it over generations, right? That was quite the lengthy article, I remember. And from there, we then went on to Katie Moran, right? And she showed us a Venn diagram. Do you remember what that was? What was the Venn diagram that she showed us? We got one circle here, Venn diagrams, right? And one of them was what? One side. Do you remember? Nobody remembers. Oh my gosh. Cultural diversity. What was the other side? Yes, perfect. Ecological diversity. And she said, right in here, you'll notice that the vast majority of our 370 million indigenous people have a tendency to live on the front lines of the areas that are our biodiversity hotspots, right? She said, their knowledge is critical. Protecting their knowledge is critical, right? Making value of their knowledge is critical. We need to help the people that are maintaining this information that is so critical to us, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to produce that 500-page encyclopedia. Remember, we talked about this? You remember the encyclopedia that just came out a week ago? From the Brazilian Amazons, 500 pages on all the different kinds of medicinal plants, animals that are being used throughout the Amazon, right? Incredible, right? So she says we need to protect our people that are harboring all of this information and caring for this land. And the fact that it's housed in the environment means we can't separate these people from their land. If we do, it's just like erasing an entire encyclopedia, right? So, got to protect them. She gives us some ideas about how, right? From there, we went in to talk about food and medicine, right? Talked about food, medicine, genetic engineering. What do you remember from this week? What was significant to you from this week about food? All stuff you'd learned before? Or did you learn something new? Learn something new? Like what? Anybody? Maybe you learned that we're breeding Roundup into all of the genes of things that you're eating. Or that we've gone even further because now Roundup is not strong enough. Now we're breeding in 2,4-D, right? Which is the equivalent of what we've used in Agent Orange, right? So those things were pretty shocking to us, right? What happened this last week related to genetic engineering? Do you know? Are you keeping your eyes open? It's not about food. Anybody know? If there's one thing I could give you, it would be to read the news. Oh, Pandora's box was opened. We genetically altered a set of twins, brought them to term, right? They've been given birth, they're in existence now, and we genetically altered these children. We used the CRISPR. Remember, we learned about the CRISPR, more recent technology, so we could just cut into the DNA. And we altered a little piece of their DNA strand. Might not seem very significant, right? But let's consider this. We altered the DNA of these two individuals and everything that comes after them. right? Huge criticism, right? What did we do? What did we alter? Does anybody know what genes we altered? We made them resistant to something, which is weird, right? The whole concept of resistance is like a vaccine, so it's like a little scary. Do you know? AIDS. So we've designed babies, that's a new concept now, huh? We've designed babies to now be resistant to AIDS. That means all of their successors, children, offspring, will also be resistant to AIDS, right? Anybody want to have kids and send their kids to go partner up with these ones? Oh, right? I'm kidding, right? But in essence, we've figured a way to drive certain characteristics, like a gene drive, in humanity. If we don't want AIDS around, we'll genetically alter our genes so we don't have it around. Same thing with cancer. Same thing with anything that you don't want. Uh-oh. Can you see Malthus coming back into play and his concern about overpopulation as we go down this road? It's crazy, right? It's difficult to talk about the ethics of medicine in this regard, right? It can be a sensitive discussion. So this happened this week, and yeah, it's a Pandora's box, so we'll see what happens in the future with it. He had his hand slapped, right? A lot of people said, no, this was terribly done in that it wasn't past any ethics consideration. China doesn't want it. They're not happy about it, right? From there, we went on to talk about cannibalism. Yay, right? We talked about cannibalism during Halloween. More from the perspective of how it was used in a justification for colonialism, right? Using it in a way, kind of bringing back that concern of Lewis Henry Morgan. Oh, they're savages, right? And if they're savages, then I guess that justifies dominating them and bringing them into a more enlightened kind of behavior, or Christian, as it were, right? So that was kind of a fun piece, right? From there, we went into medical, talked about different kinds of diseases, talked about AIDS in there too, right? And what we think about solving it, even being an expensive kind of thing, right? We talked about medicine being healthy for the wealthy, right? We looked at greasy sickness as possibly trauma versus spiritual possession, right? And we got some good evidence for both, right? Like, we know there's been a lot of trauma with 10 years of civil war. We also know that we have some good evidence to suggest that it was spiritual possession, which is difficult for us to even take a look at, right? Lethal gift of livestock worked right off of the Pleistocene overkill theory. How was that? We had the Pleistocene overkill theory that said, we killed off all of our megafauna during the Pleistocene era, right? And then Jared Diamond comes in and he says, and therefore, we had lots of diseases. Huge, massive die-off of the population. Well, what's the connection there? What was the connection that we discovered in that reading? Most of our diseases have come from animals, yeah? And when we're not around them, we don't develop the immunities, right? Even to specific animals, right? We can look at the swine flu, bird flu, and all those kinds of things, chicken pox, whatnot. All right, from there we went on to legal anthropology and into the UN DRIP. Talked about how it was passed in 2007. 4 countries said no way, right? But the 4 countries since then have signed a couple of, endorsed a couple of the articles, right? What's the article you don't think that they would endorse? One of the main articles that you think that they would not endorse. Can anybody think of it? One of the biggest reasons why the U.S. government won't sign the whole entire declaration, go, yes! What is it? All the land is indigenous land, right? So it's like, I'm going to have to sign all the land over. So this is kind of almost darn near impossible for us. So we've just endorsed a few of the articles, right? Same thing with Canada, although Canada has a lot more experience with missing women. Remember talking about that? The What About Me campaign, or Am I Next campaign, right? We've had a couple of other cases for Canadian women recently, and I want to know if you're aware of it. Are you aware that we had a significant issue? I think, gosh, I want to say it was in Montreal, but I'm not positive if it was in Ontario, Montreal, Toronto area, or if it was elsewhere. But in Canada, we had a case that was reported to the news in the last 2 weeks, right? Last 2 weeks. And we found out that Indigenous women have been undergoing forced sterilization. How many people heard about this? Nobody in class. Okay, so it's new news, right? Within 2 days of announcing this case, you should know that 90 women, within 2 days, 90 women signed on to this case as a class action suit. That means 180 people, right? Because there are men and women in a couple, 180 people that gave birth that had to go through being forced sterilized, right? So that's a new case that is adding to this issue of assaults against Canadian Indigenous women, right? With New Zealand, with Australia, we have cases where we've removed children, right? Put them into foster care, and they ended up being more like slaves in their areas. So those are some of the bigger reasons why those 4 didn't sign, right? Talked about a few different things related to the UN DRIP, among them land, also demilitarizing land, if you remember that. Protection of special cultural rights like bilingual education and the like, yeah? And then we went on to talk about the US position about how we define Indigenous. How do we define Indigenous here in the United States? Yeah, we got the definition from the UN DRIP. Yeah, we got the definition or some kind of a reference in the ILO. But this is nothing as to what our country has decided. Remember, Nicaragua decided Indigenous meant that your tribal group accepts you as a member, right? Don't do that here. How do we do it here? Blood, right? Blood. How much? 25, right? 25%, drop below, not Indigenous, lost your rights. So we call this genocidal, right? This kind of law where we're whittling down our population numbers, right? Just to remind you, over here at San Manuel, we have about 100 to 150 tribal members. Up the road at Morongo, down the 10, we have about 800 tribal members. Makes us ask the question, how many generations are left? I don't know if San Manuel has many generations left, right? Thinking about it. So from there, we went on to political anthropology and colonialism and imperialism. I'm going to click on this because I think that there were some definitions that we got at the bottom of this lecture that we want to review. Okay. So we talked about whaling, and then we went into world systems theory. Just to remind you, we talked about how colonialism, exploring, right, that whole piece, developed that core periphery kind of economic relationship that now you see in the first world, second world, third world, right? So what we had during the 1400s, now we see in our multi-tiered economic world, right? So that emergence of world systems. We talked about the difference of colonialism and imperialism being, imperialism has brute force, right? So colonialism might be about setting up a colony, sending back the resources to the motherland. Imperialism means that we've parked a battleship in the bay or armed a group and surrounded the area kind of thing, right? So we're talking about something that's a lot more military grade there. we still say that Hawaii is an illegally occupied nation and that the force that's occupying it is imperialistic. That makes perfect sense. Yes, when you look at this, when you look at the fact that we have completely militarized this place that's called Hawaii. Yeah? This is exactly what we've done. It's imperialized. Yeah. All right. Reviewing the global approaches to Indigenous people, we said we started off thinking that they needed protection, right? They weren't able to protect themselves, so we developed this kind of arm to protect them, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Unfortunately, it was really full of fraud, right? From there, we moved to integrationism, where we wanted to assimilate them and use their lands, settling their lands as well. Now, if you look up protectionism and integrationism on Google, you will come up with the wrong answer for the exam. Okay? Got that? Did everybody hear that? Everybody listening? Oh, look at me. Go up here instead, and you'll find the search site right there. Use Google, you get it wrong. Find the search site, you get it right. Okay? All right. I'm just saying this repeatedly because it's happened a lot on exams. Okay? All right. So, from integrationism, we move to this idea that, well, we need to preserve the indigenous people. We instigate cultural reserves. You see them all throughout Central America, these things called cultural reserves, right? Where we want to protect the indigenous people in situ or on site, just as they were, as if they're in a living museum. This is where we get concerned that they're using modern technology. This is where we get concerned that they're going to evolve and change, right? And what it might mean for the natural resources and the rest of the global community. So we start to get concerned about this, and over time, we've become a little bit more enlightened. I don't know if it's enlightened or standing up more for the human rights aspect of it. But in this regard, now we're taking a shift from, oh, we need to protect them just the way they are, make sure that they don't change, to we need to make sure we give them the right to change, just as they decide that they want to change. Standing up for their self-determination, we call it, right? We made reference to two other concepts. I wanted to make reference especially to these concepts because looking in Hawaii, looking at other kind of movements on indigeneity, we tend to confuse these two concepts of autonomy and sovereignty. Right now, there's a lot of movements in Hawaii that talk about sovereignty, although it means nothing like what it is in international law. So international law says sovereignty means royal power and authority. That means if you have sovereignty, you can tell the US government to get the heck out, or the UN for that matter, right? And they got to get out because you're authoritative on those lands to a level of royal power and authority, right? So autonomy is just having one's own laws, and you may be afforded the chance to assert it, and you may not be, right? If you have sovereignty, then, of course, you have autonomy as well. Okay? All right. Cultural change and development. Talked about Paulo Freire. Talked about the need to think about change as not coming from the outside. We talked about the kind of change that comes from the outside, like development and the like, as being something that can threaten the well-being of the people, right? Whereas if we're having the opportunity to develop change from the inside, it's something that is on our agenda, right? Or our plate, or our desires change based on our culture, right? And we reviewed the Augustine case as one of the first. I mean, I wonder, you all got that this is the very first international land rights case in the world, right? Like, this is the very first international land rights case where land was transferred to Indigenous people in a sovereign way, given full legal rights. Yes? Do we really all understand that? That set the precedence for what we're now seeing, right? Right now in Panama, we have a massive countrywide project in titling Indigenous land to Indigenous people. My old boss has 55 territories that he has to title, right? This is all based on what Nicaragua did. Nicaragua did, right? Your patrimony, right? Your country. Amazing. I mean, if I could write to the country and say, wow, you've been a leader for the whole world, I would, in a way that, you know, to recognize that, because really that methodology is now not just being transferred into Panama, it's being transferred all around the world, Middle East, Europe, Africa. Australia has some new cases that are just hitting the world news now as well. So these methodologies had made tremendous application for Indigenous land rights around the world. And guess what? It's coming here too. Right? We have people on our campus. How many people know this? We have people on our campus that are teaching you this methodology of how to work with GIS and how to work with Native American tribal groups on defending their lands, defending their legal and historical land rights claim. How many people know that? Don't know that. Okay. I will try and get the names of those professors that are doing that. We have a May term that's going to Panama to work on exactly this stuff. So if you guys are interested in this, get into the field, get on it, because this is exciting stuff. And you can make an incredible impact and contribution to the world, humanity, and also to Indigenous people that, as we know, have been marginalized for centuries, right? Okay, so I'd encourage all of you to get onwards with that kind of an effort, all right? Okay, so that's our review of our semester. For next class, we'll come in and I will post the exam and we'll take a look at the exam, right? So if there's any questions you have on it, we can go over it. We'll talk about any extra assignments. Then lastly, before you guys leave, on Monday, I know I said we're not gonna have class on Monday, right? Oh, but we are. No, I'm kidding. That'd be terrible, wouldn't it? No, here's what I'm going to do instead. I'm going to show up. And you guys can either show up or not show up, but I'm going to be here, which means if you want to bring your draft for your research essay, I'll read it and give you feedback. Same thing with your exam. If you want me to read anything, if you want to ask me any questions, I'll be here during class time and I can help you with anything, right? Because all of our assignments are going to be due on the 12th. So if I'll be here on the 10th, that gives you 2 extra days to do anything else beyond that. Okay? All right. So feel free to email me with any questions. When we come back next, you'll have your grades up and available for a review.